The LaLaurie Mansion is notorious in American history, almost as much as its mistress, Delphine LaLaurie. She's been given such monikers as first female serial killer, the Lady Nero, the Savage Mistress, and the new Lucretia Borgia. Countless books, articles, and movies have been made about her horrific exploits. Her home is possibly the most famous haunted house in the state of Louisiana and was even owned by actor Nicolas Cage. This episode will first highlight the traditional stories of Madame LaLaurie. This is a refresher for those who know about the home, as well as a discussion history for those who don't. There may be details missing or added, depending upon the version you know.
And here we go.
The magnificent antebellum mansion was home to the rich and powerful LaLaurie family in New Orleans. Dr. Louis LaLaurie and his wife Delphine were esteemed, respected, and adored in Old Orleans society. Their home saw such esteemed guests as Marshal Ney, General Lafayette, and King Louis Philippe of France. The architectural masterpiece was constructed in 1832. The 5-story home had massive chandeliers and mahogany wood throughout. Every piece was rich and elegant, and every person in the city wanted to attend their luxurious social functions. Guests dined on the finest food, were surrounded with the richest fabrics and upholsteries, and were treated to a variety of Epicurean delights. But something wasn't as it should be. The initial suspicions were merely treated as that. After all, Dr. LaLaurie was successful, and his wife was a beautiful and gracious hostess. Yet, visitors noticed slaves were brought into the home far more frequently than they should. Neighbors noticed many old familiar faces amid the mansion's slaves vanished. No word as to what happened to them or acknowledgement from the family as to where they went. The end of the LaLaurie power began with a neighbor who witnessed Madame LaLaurie chase a slave girl through the house. She screamed and brandished a whip. The neighbor watched from afar as Delphine eventually grew closer to the girl. They both ran onto the roof. The girl jumped to her death. The horrified neighbor continued to watch. The girl was buried in a shallow grave in the backyard. This was the final act that caught the authorities' attention. New Orleans had anti-cruelty laws for slaves frequently called the Black Code. This family was not only forced to relinquish their slaves, authorities forbade them from ever owning any again. Madame LaLaurie was unapologetic and had relatives buy their slaves when they went to be auctioned. She then purchased the slaves back without drawing attention. A few rumors at the time suggest the slaves knew too many dark secrets about the family. Life continued as usual at the mansion, but people started to change. Suddenly, invitations were returned. People began having serious doubts about the once-favored family. Locals didn't want to be involved with them. Shortly after their social standing declined, a fire broke out in the home. It quickly spread, and the authorities rushed to the scene. Once the fire was extinguished, the macabre and hideous secrets of the LaLaurie family came to light. The firefighters had to see every room in order to properly ascertain the damage, so they broke into ones that were locked. A group inspected the damage to the attic when they found a locked and secured door. What they found beyond sent most of them fleeing the scene. Madame LaLaurie was a human butcher of epic proportions. Slaves were found chained to the walls in one of the attic apartments. Some were in the middle of hideous experiments that had left them permanently disfigured. Many were locked in tiny cages. Several victims had their limbs broken and reset in bizarre angles. Some had mouths sewn shut. Some accounts stated that the LaLaurie family had a makeshift operating chamber inside that room, and there were human organs cast across the floor. Some had their tongues removed, their hands nailed to the floor, and their fingernails ripped out. Chained slaves were found throughout home. The family cook was a 70-year-old slave who'd been chained up in the kitchen. The chain was only 24 feet long, so she was never allowed to leave the room. She said she dreamed that the curtains were on fire the night before. She liked the idea, so she made it a reality. They found Delphine had a torturous rig over the old well in the backyard. She kept unruly slaves chained up in the well in water up to their chins. If they drowned, she simply tied weights around their bodies and let them sink. She utilized this punishment for babies as well as children and adult slaves. A total of 20 barely breathing bodies were carried out. Those who survived were permanently handicapped. Several asked to be killed because they were in such pain. Thousands of locals came to visit the suffering. 2 died later that day because help had come too late. Anger overtook the city. A few nights later, a lynch mob formed outside the mansion to bring some justice to the prominent family. As they gathered, a carriage rammed through the gate to the home and raced into the night. The LaLaurie family vanished. The angry mob attacked the home, stripped it, and vandalized the building. They set everything on fire. It later fell into ruin. Nothing more is known or documented of the LaLaurie family. Rumors came that they fled to neighboring towns and were sheltered by relatives. Others stated they left the country and traveled back to France. They were never brought to justice. The building passed from owner to owner. No one could keep it for any length of time. Businesses attempted to use the building but couldn't remain. There have been reports of paranormal activity in the building since the LaLaurie family fled in the night. Nearly a century later, it was purchased by individuals who turned it into luxurious upscale apartments. During the renovation to change the home into these fine living facilities, a room in the back of the house had to be repaired. When workers pulled up the original boards, they found an entire graveyard of bodies. It was assumed that this was the final resting place for all the slaves who vanished. The haunted home now belongs to infamy and notoriety due to the cruelties of a single woman.
Warning, warning, caution.
Now a warning. Now a warning?
If you are primarily interested in a good ghost story and not actual history, stop the video here and go on to another. What you learn beyond this point may be in direct opposition to the story you know. Once you learn the facts behind this story, you won't be able to unsee them, and it might ruin a favorite story.
We have such sights to show you.
I can't stress how much the story differs from reality. What makes it worse is the number of typically reliable sources who repeat this same tale. Naturally, those who make money from its infamy desire to perpetuate the tale. But if something isn't true, it simply isn't true. Modern audiences do not love movies and films any less because they are fiction, which is what most of this story is. I'll also begin with a disclaimer. New Orleans, like many other southern locales, had stringent laws against the inhumane treatment of servants and slaves. Louisiana had a code noir, or black code, which it enforced long before it was part of the Louisiana Purchase. Those laws began in 1724. This is not in any way to say slavery was anything other than a horrific, abominable system that deserved to be exterminated. This is also not to say that all slave owners followed the law. We know many did not. This simply means the practice in that area had regulation. At that time, New Orleans was one of the most diverse and ethnically rich cities in America. As such, those laws were observed. Most residents of New Orleans during that period were multilingual. European stars and celebrities frequented New Orleans's theaters. Society ladies wore clothing from designers in Paris. Their laces were from Brussels. Their diamonds were from Amsterdam. Gentlemen's suits were commonly tailored in London. The city was an original melting pot that receives little recognition for that rich history today. We must also understand the atmosphere of the time. The LaLaurie mythos had little to do with what did or didn't happen on Royal Street. Northern publications latched onto this story to exploit what they wanted Southern slaves to have endured. They didn't just want it to be true, they needed it to be true. In the 1830s, it was important for the Southern states to be hated. They were seen as traitors for leaving the Union. That's the primary reason this story achieved traction. As a result, the story was carried from paper to paper, embellished and adorned with further fictions. There was indeed a LaLaurie family who lived in New Orleans. They did indeed live in the infamous house. They did have slaves. They probably did purchase more than most, but the reason for their purchase was quite different. That's the extent of this story agreeing with fact. So how did it all begin? 2 centuries ago, Delphine LaLaurie was Delphine McCarty. She first married a powerful Spanish military officer named Don Ramon López y Ongolo de Candelaria. They were happily married for a time and welcomed daughter Borquita. Sadly, shortly after her birth, her father died. Delphine went through the proper mourning period and then married banker Jean Blanc. They enjoyed years together and had 2 more daughters. Just as with Señor Candelaria, Blanc died. Her third and final husband was Dr. Nicolas Louis LaLaurie. He was a faculty member with the Academy of Sciences in Paris. She gave him the LaLaurie Mansion as a wedding gift. They did not build the home. She purchased it from the previous owner, Edmond Sonia Dufoso, in 1831. For most of the 1800s, the LaLaurie Mansion was known as Madame Blanc's. The home was actually built in 1780. All the building materials were imported from France. The original owner was Jean Remery. Another family rumored to have owned the house was the Pontalba family. It is very plausible such guests as Marquis de Lafayette, Louis-Philippe, and Marshal Ney were guests during these years. There are many problems with the accepted mythos. To keep matters concise, we'll only highlight the most notable. Primarily, there was simply no motive. She was not a doctor or scientist. She would have had no purpose for dissecting humans, slaves, or otherwise. She would have had to risk everything in her world for what brought absolutely no reward. Slaves were incredibly expensive, which is why less than 20% of Southerners owned them. A slave might have cost a minimum of $800 in 1860, but that's the equivalent of $30,000 today. One slave easily cost more than most houses at that time. That's also why many areas had laws that governed the industry. Dr. Louis LaLaurie was the scientist and a doctor, so it makes no sense his wife would be the individual to experiment on slaves. Nor does it make sense that the servants in the house wore chains because the family had so many visitors. Visitors in addition to the children's governesses, nurses, teachers, maids, gardeners, and any of the other staff typical of a New Orleans manor. That left very little time or room for experimentation on slaves. It also left very little chance of hiding such criminal behavior. The LaLaurie family were not social pariahs. They were in good standing with local law enforcement and politicians. The home's condition presents another issue. It was never burned by an angry mob or otherwise. We know this because of the original materials in the home's construction. There were a few pieces of furniture left from Delphine's time, even as late as the 1930s. There were also a number of pieces given to the Louisiana State Museum. There was no fire damage. There is no evidence to support the possibility that an unruly mob crashed the place or destroyed its contents. The date of the alleged house fire also frequently changes. Sometimes it was in April, sometimes in May. It might have happened on the 5th or the 10th. It usually happens in the year 1834. There are also vastly differing discrepancies in the number of victims. Sometimes 6 slaves were taken out of the home, sometimes 20. Sometimes 2 died from their injuries, and other version states they didn't. Sometimes the slaves were only chained in the attic, sometimes the attic and kitchen, and several accounts state they were chained all over the house. The lack of coverage is yet another issue. New Orleans had many newspapers during that time. Such a sensational story would have been syndicated far and wide. There are no such accounts. The story soon died down until the 1880s. It was revived for articles on haunted houses in New Orleans. It should also be noted that counter-arguments were printed against the story, but just couldn't compete with the allure of a female serial killer. Delphine and Louis did not live happily ever after. Their relationship strained and they separated. The reason for this is unknown, but likely due to simple family issues. He moved away, and Delphine remained in New Orleans with the children. She died in 1849 and was buried in the St. Louis Cemetery. She did not die in Paris or some other faraway place. Louis moved to Cuba and lived the remainder of his life there. Since the home was a wedding gift to him, Delphine put it up for sale. It was sold in 1837 and ceased to be the LaLaurie Mansion. It is likely she just moved in with one of her children to live out the remainder of her life. Several newspaper accounts at this time do state the home was haunted even then. Neighbors reported doors opening and closing themselves and strange sounds through the empty house. One woman claimed she saw a phantom man walk with his head in his arms. Other rumors said if you spoke to the phantom people there, they would vanish. Still others claimed a ghostly procession traveled up through the home nightly. Spirits often flitted about the home as lights. So what caused the home's activity? That we may never know. The home's genuine history has been quite overshadowed by the legends. Rather than postulate over what might or might not have happened, we'll continue with what is known. The sad fact is that Delphine emancipated slaves. She didn't torture or kill them. It should be noted that there is no current known number for how many slaves she freed. I located records for several emancipations, but there could be many more. Delphine began emancipating slaves in 1819. This practice continued onward for an indefinite amount of time. The last currently known record for her emancipating a slave was 1848, the year before she died. So where did those hugely false and creative stories come from? It's a tale as old as time itself. Delphine's chief accuser was named Mantroy. He was the neighbor who watched Delphine chase the slave girl onto the roof, where she jumped to her death. He never admitted it, but he was Mantroy de Candelaria, Delphine's former brother-in-law. He resented her for inheriting his brother's wealth and buying the mansion next door. He hated her family just as much. In nearly all detailed inflammatory articles from that era, Mantroy not only named himself as the chief witness to the carnage, he included several of his friends who helped liberate those poor slaves. An Englishman opened the mansion as a music conservatory in 1882. A short time later, scathing articles ran in local publications attacked and maligned his character so badly he had to close. Like LaLaurie, the allegations against him were baseless. Neighbors said the spirits held a high carnival when they closed the school. It would seem like the home's primary supernatural weapon was targeting the owners with public humiliation. The home remained closed for some time. Jules-Édouard Vigine bought it. The old French Revolution soldier had retired to New Orleans. He was an enigmatic recluse for several years. Neighbors only knew of his death when they saw the crepe wreath on his door. The home was briefly a bar and then a tenement apartment building. It seemed like the house brought nothing but bad luck to any who owned it, until William Warrington. He was the son of a wealthy, old money family in Louisiana. Around 1885, he went for a walk and just happened upon his ancestors' once fine home. Ironically, he was the great-great-great-grandson of builder Jean Remery. He had no idea the home had fallen into such ruin. The 40-room mansion was now derelict. He purchased it and began renovations. The infamous house then became known as the Warrington House. Warrington turned his back on the family wealth. He first opened the home as a school for the poor. He then noticed everyone who came was hungry, so he began also feeding his students. When 100 students attended every day, he decided to devote his life to them. He began housing 75 homeless individuals each night at the mansion and feeding around 400 every day. His house operated independent from other charities and organizations. He did not have any red tape for those he helped. He did not investigate them when they arrived. They came, were fed, and he listened to their story while they ate. He had no knowledge of persons abusing his generosity, even as late as 1929. Before the Depression, Warrington had fed over 250,000 people just during his time. The home has an incredible past, with a variety of characters who live there. No matter which version of history you prefer, the home is in a class of its own. Be sure to like this video and subscribe so you'll be notified as soon as we upload more videos on the paranormal world. Thanks for watching.